The sun hadn't fully risen when the trucks stopped outside the wire. Frost clung to the barbed edges, and breath steamed from a line of German women standing in silence. The snow under their boots was already trampled flat thousands of steps of surrender. Then came the order. A Soviet sergeant barked something in Russian. A translator, barely older than 20, hesitated before saying it aloud. "Remove your uniforms." No one moved. The women stared at him, at each other, at the sky. The silence was heavier than the cold. For a moment it felt like humiliation was about to begin. The kind they'd been warned about. Then one girl, trembling, unbuttoned her grey jacket. The sound of that single metal clasp echoed through the courtyard like a gunshot. One by one, the uniforms hit the ground, grey wool ironed collars. Insignias that once meant pride, now just fabric in the snow. Reports later counted over 3,000 female Wehrmacht auxiliaries captured across Poland and Czechoslovakia that spring. Many were clerks, radio operators, field nurses. Most hadn't fired a shot, but in that moment it didn't matter who had held a weapon or who hadn't. The war had stripped them all the same. The guards collected the uniforms into a pile. Steam rose from the heap, mingling with the women's breath in the cold air. A few cried quietly. One whispered, "They'll burn them. They'll burn us next." But no flames came. The guards didn't light torches or shout insults. They simply stood, watching. From somewhere near the gate, a camera shutter clicked, a Soviet officer documenting the handover. The sound snapped through the silence like a verdict. The women felt smaller, exposed, and yet unsure what the punishment would be. One of them muttered under her breath, "They took our uniforms and something else too." A guard turned away, his boots crunching over ice. He said nothing, just gestured toward the storage shed. Minutes later, another group of soldiers appeared, carrying not rifles, but wooden crates. Inside, folded cloth, coats, scarves, colors too bright for war. The women looked at each other, confused. The guards began to hand them out, and that's when the unthinkable happened. What the guards did next would leave every German woman POW stunned. The crates hit the ground with a dull thud, wood against frozen mud. Everyone braced for the sound of rifles, for another order barked in Russian. Instead, a guard knelt, pried open a lid and pulled out a dress. A floral civilian dress, faded blue with tiny white dots. For a few seconds, no one moved. The women just stared, some half, dressed, arms crossed against the cold, trying to understand what game this was. One guard, his face windburned and unreadable, placed the dress on a steel chair and nodded toward a young blonde prisoner. "You'll need this more," the translator murmured. The girl didn't move. Another soldier stepped forward, carrying wool coats, scarves, even boots, garments looted or donated from depots meant for refugees. It wasn't pity, it was procedure. Soviet supply records show their field depots carried tens of thousands of captured garments intended for displaced civilians after the front lines collapsed. But to the women standing there, shivering in disbelief, it felt like mockery. When Anna, one of the clerks, reached for a plain brown coat, her hands shook. The fabric was warm, soft, too gentle for this place. She whispered later, "I felt more naked in that dress than without it. The uniform had been armor. This felt like exposure." A few guards turned away, embarrassed. They'd fought these women's brothers, seen their villages burned, and now here they were helping them dress like ordinary people again. For a moment, it looked like both sides wanted to forget who they were. Then came another sound, the clang of a ladle against a metal pot. Food from the camp's edge, a soldier wheeled in a cart of steaming tins. The smell of barley and meat drifted through the yard, sharp and almost sweet. The women froze again. This wasn't interrogation. It wasn't punishment. It was something they couldn't name. Mercy, maybe, or confusion. One guard muttered something in Russian and pointed toward the mess line. "Eat," the translator said simply. The first woman hesitated, then stepped forward. The line began to move. For the first time since their capture, the camp was filled not with shouts, but the sound of spoons scraping metal bowls. But as the steam rose, so did suspicion. Why were the guards being kind? Steam drifted across the courtyard, mixing with the smoke of burnt wood. The scent hit first barley, onion, meat. It cut through the stink of sweat, damp fabric, and fear. For days, the women had been living on crusts and boiled water. Now, suddenly, tin pots gleamed under the grey light as a Soviet cook stirred with a ladle big enough to bend steel. Anna's stomach clenched before her mind caught up. She had once served behind a German field kitchen. She knew the hierarchy of hunger. Soldiers first, then officers, then the rest. But here the enemy served her. The line shuffled forward. A guard held out a bowl, his gloves blackened with soot. Next, he said, the stew hit the tin with a wet thumper, heavy, thick, real food. Anna's fingers burned from the heat, but she didn't let go. Around her, spoons clinked, breath fogged, and for a few strange minutes no one remembered they were prisoners. Archival records show Soviet POW camps in 1945 averaged 800 calories a day, barely survival, but on that day, eyewitness diaries mention barley soup with meat. Over 500 calories, enough to bring color back to frozen faces, enough to spark a dangerous thought. Maybe they weren't going to die here. A woman beside Anna murmured, "They're fattening us up." Another answered, "No, they're showing off." The theories spiraled, but none could explain the small smile one guard gave when an old woman whispered dank. Anna lifted her bowl, the steam fogging her lashes. The taste was rough, earthy, salt, grain, smoke. Tears came without warning. She turned away, ashamed. Across the yard, a guard noticed, paused, then went back to stirring the pot. "I never thought I'd eat from their hands," she wrote later. "It was the first time in months I didn't feel like prey. But kindness is a currency no one trusts in war." As night fell, whispers crept through the barracks, rumors of cameras, propaganda films, hidden motives. The women huddled together, clutching their coats, wondering what debt they had unknowingly accepted. And by dawn, when the guards returned, no one was hungry anymore, just afraid to ask why. Night swallowed the camp in a slow, bitter hush. The wind moaned through cracks in the barracks, rattling tin cups and shaking the frost off window edges. Inside, the women whispered theories in half-sleep. "They're filming us." One said, "Propaganda, maybe." Another muttered, "No one gives out food for free." The air was thick with suspicion, and the smell of boiled potatoes that still lingered from dinner. The next morning brought no punishment, no interrogation, only an eerie routine. A Soviet medic entered, a roll of bandages slung over her shoulder. "Inspection," she said curtly. One by one, she cleaned frostbite wounds, checked fevers, and taped broken fingers. When her hands brushed a prisoner's skin, the woman flinched, expecting pain, insult, something cruel. But none came. The medic's expression never changed, just focus, just work. Anna watched in disbelief. She'd grown up with stories of Bolshevik monsters, of brutality beyond words. Yet here was one wrapping a clean bandage around her hand, tightening it gently. Anna whispered, "Why?" The medic only shrugged. "Rules are rules." Reports from the period show Soviet field hospitals treating over 40 POW by mid-1945, many of them civilians and auxiliaries. The Geneva Protocols weren't formally applied here, but something else was: exhaustion. The guards had seen too much death to create more. Still, disbelief ran deep. Every kindness looked like bait. When the medic offered a cup of boiled water, Anna hesitated before drinking. Every kindness felt like a trap. She'd later write, "And yet, I drank." That night, snow began to fall again. The barracks roof hissed with melting frost. In a dark corner, Anna tore a scrap from a ration box and found a pencil stub near the stove. She started to write, not for anyone else, just to keep her mind steady. Day 7, the first line read, "We are fed, we are confused." The pencil scratched softly against cardboard. Outside, the guards laughed faintly around a fire. Their voices were distant, almost human. Anna paused. looked at the glowing stove and pressed the pencil down harder. If I survive, she thought, someone will need to read this. She didn't know that tiny scrap of paper would outlive the camp itself. The pencil was dull, the paper torn from a ration box, but it was enough. Each night, Anna wrote by the flicker of a single oil lamp, shielding the words with her palm when the door creaked open. Day 7, the first line said, "We are fed, we are confused." The handwriting trembled from cold, but her mind was sharp, recording everything that didn't make sense. By day, she shoveled snow, stitched torn gloves, mended fences. By night, she wrote about the guards' strange habits, their jokes, their fatigue, the way one of them always hummed before lights out. These weren't the monsters she'd been told about. They were soldiers with blistered feet and hollow eyes. He looked younger than my brother, she noted, and more tired. Anna's notes weren't heroic. They were small, human observations, the sort that history usually skips. When one guard shared his cigarette, she didn't call it mercy. She called it a strange pause in hate. She noticed how some soldiers brought extra firewood for the sick, how they buried frostbitten corpses quietly at night rather than at dawn roll call. No speeches, no pity, just gestures that didn't fit the war. Records indicate that roughly 22% of captured female auxiliaries were under 25. Most had joined for rations, not ideology. Anna saw that now. Her fellow prisoners weren't hardened Nazis. They were clerks, typists, nurses. Girls who'd worn uniforms for the same reason men wore armor, to feel less powerless. Each word she wrote loosened something inside her. The hate she'd been raised on began to crumble, replaced by a kind of exhaustion that felt almost like peace. "They don't know why they're kind," she scribbled one night. "Maybe they've forgotten how not to be." But her writing didn't go unnoticed. During a random inspection, a guard found the stub of her pencil. He didn't confiscate it. He only pointed at her coat and said in rough German, "Hide better." Then he walked away. The next day, new orders arrived. The women were told to gather outside at dawn. The guards brought back their old uniforms, but when Anna saw them, her stomach turned. The insignias were gone, the sleeves ripped. Their old lives were about to return stripped of everything that made them proud. The morning was bone, white and windless. Snowflakes floated down like ash as the guards dragged in the uniforms folded, altered, unrecognizable. The women gathered in silence. Anna's breath caught when she saw her old jacket. The eagle insignia was gone. The shoulder tabs ripped, the sleeves crudely cut and re-stitched with rough thread. It wasn't a uniform anymore. It was a rag. A Soviet lieutenant tossed one across the line, work clothes. The translator said, no one moved to take it. The lieutenant repeated the order, quieter this time, almost embarrassed. The women obeyed. The grey wool clung to them again, but now it smelled of soap and smoke instead of command. The message was unmistakable. Their war was over. Their new battle was survival. Reports confirm that by mid-1945, over 2 million German POW, men and women, were reassigned to reconstruction projects across Eastern Europe. Rebuilding the ruins their own army had made was the new sentence. Anna stared at her reflection in a sheet of broken glass propped against a wall. The jacket hung crooked on her shoulders, the torn insignia like a wound. Our own uniforms turned into rags for peace, she wrote later. The guards handed out tools next shovels, hammers, buckets. The orders were simple: clear rubble, patch roofs, dig foundations. But as the women marched out, their steps fell into a rhythm that felt familiar, not military, human. They walked east toward the skeletal outline of a destroyed town Glogau. Once a German stronghold, now Soviet, had ministered ruin. 98% of it reduced to dust during the siege. Streets where they'd once marched in parades were now trenches of brick and bone. Anna adjusted the torn sleeve of her jacket and looked at the women beside her. They carried buckets instead of rifles, wore boots lined with newspaper, faces half, burned by frost. Yet somehow the silence between them was lighter, A guard trudged beside them, his rifle slung low, muttering in Russian about rebuilding homes. The phrase stuck with Anna. Whose homes? The question twisted in her gut as they entered the outskirts, where smoke still rose from chimneys rebuilt by other prisoners. The sound of shovels biting into rubble echoed across the ruins. For the first time, the enemy and the defeated worked side by side. The smell of brick dust and damp ash hit before they even entered the town. Głogów, once fortress, now carcass. Windows shattered, roofs gone, chimneys standing like blackened tombstones. Every step crunched on glass and bone. The wind hissed through hollow walls, carrying echoes of German commands that no longer mattered. The women were divided into work groups: diggers, carriers, patchers. Anna's group was sent to clear the rubble from what had once been a school. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same classrooms where Hitler Youth had once shouted slogans were now filled with silence and ash. Beside her, a Soviet widow swung a pickaxe with steady rhythm. Her husband had died fighting the same army Anna had served. Yet she didn't look at Anna with hatred, just exhaustion. They worked side by side, their breath sinking in the cold. Głogów had lost 98% of its buildings during the siege of 1945. Not a single street remained whole. Statistics from Soviet records show that German POW labor rebuilt more than 400 structures there within the next 2 years. But those were just numbers. The reality was sweat, bruised hands, and a quiet reckoning between enemies. At noon, the guards brought water in tin pails. The Soviet widow wiped her forehead, then wordlessly offered the dipper to Anna. The German hesitated. The other woman nodded once. Anna drank. The water was muddy, metallic, but it felt like a truce. We were building homes for the ghosts we made. Anna wrote that night, her fingers trembling. Every brick was an apology no one had asked for. When the work ended for the day, the women sat on a broken step, too tired to speak. One guard passed by, humming softly. The same tune drifted from another worker farther down the street. Anna recognized it. A Russian lullaby she'd heard whispered in the barracks. She looked at the widow again, who was staring into the smoke, filled sunset, eyes unreadable. Then, quietly, the woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled cigarette. She offered it to Anna. Anna blinked, unsure if she should take it. The guard near the gate noticed, and didn't stop her. The cigarette burned slowly between them, its smoke curling through the ruins of Głogów. The match flared, brief and golden against the grey. For a heartbeat, both women froze, one German, one Soviet, faces lit by the same fragile light. Then the Soviet nurse cupped her hands around the flame and said softly, "War's over, breathe now." The cigarette tip glowed, smoke curling upward like a ghost released. Anna drew in a shallow puff. The tobacco was harsh, dry, but it carried warmth deeper than food. For a few seconds, the ruins disappeared. There was no Głogów, no rubble, no walls of language between them. Just two survivors sharing something that tasted almost human. Around them, other POW worked in silence, some glancing over, others pretending not to see. The guard at the gate leaned on his rifle, pretending he hadn't noticed either. But everyone felt the same strange calm settle over the yard. Records from that winter show a 60% drop in mortality across Soviet POW camps after labor integration began in late 1945. Soviet and German workers, forced to coexist, somehow made survival more efficient, and in rare pockets like this, more bearable. Anna exhaled, watching the smoke mingle with the breath of a former enemy. "I didn't know how to say thank you in any language," she would later write. The nurse only nodded and stared toward the ruins. Her husband was buried somewhere in that rubble, Anna realized. And still, she'd shared her last cigarette. When the cigarette burned low, Anna ground it into the ash with her boot. The nurse stood, brushing dust from her coat. "Tomorrow," she said in Russian, then walked away without looking back. Anna didn't move for a long time. The world around her was too quiet, no gunfire, no shouting, only the creak of settling stone and the far-off whistle of wind through empty buildings. That night, back in the barracks, the guards brought out something none of them expected, a radio. It crackled and hissed, a wounded machine struggling to find a signal. Then, faintly through the static came music. Anna froze. The melody was unmistakably German, a lullaby. She looked around. Even the guards stopped to listen. For the first time since the surrender, the war paused long enough for everyone to remember they were still human. The first sound was static roar, electric, like wind trapped inside a wire. Then beneath it, a melody took shape. A lullaby, Leise Rieselt der Schnee, the same one German mothers had sung through winters long before the war. For a second, no one in the barracks breathed. A Soviet guard leaned against the doorframe, cigarette glowing in the dark. Another twisted the radio dial with careful fingers, chasing the fragile signal as it faded and returned. The sound was warped, ghost-like, but unmistakably German. No one spoke. The tune floated across rows of straw beds, over faces too tired to cry. Anna's chest tightened. The melody didn't sound like victory or defeat. It sounded like home, the kind of home that no longer existed. Around her, women hummed softly, afraid the guards might stop them, but the guards didn't. One of them, a young man with a bandaged wrist, started tapping his boot to the rhythm. BBC reports estimated that by 1946, over 20 million displaced persons secretly tuned into broadcasts like this across Europe. Radios were forbidden in camps, yet somehow every prisoner seemed to find one. In this place, it wasn't rebellion. It was survival through sound. The music grew louder. A guard turned down the lights. Another offered a cigarette to a prisoner without a word. For 5 minutes, there was no border, no camp, no war. Just a song floating through the smoke. Anna pressed her fingers against her eyes. The tears came hot and sudden. For 5 minutes, she wrote later, we remembered we were still alive. When the music ended, no one clapped. The radio clicked off with a pop, leaving only the sound of breathing. Then, in the darkness, the guard with the bandaged wrist said quietly, tomorrow. Orders. The words cut through the comm like a blade. Transfer orders meant movement east, new camps, new uncertainty. The women froze. Anna felt the air thicken again, the weight of dread returning to every chest. But as the guards filed out, one stayed behind. Ivan Petrovich, the same young man who tapped his boot to the music. He lingered by the radio, staring at the silent box like it might still speak. Then he whispered something no one expected, not them. Dawn broke pale and bitter, frost glinting off barbed wire. The trucks were ready. Orders had come down. The women would be transferred east to another labor site, maybe a harder one. Guards packed crates, checked rosters, shouted names that echoed through the cold. Anna stood in line clutching her coat, her journal hidden in her boot. She could already see her breath fogging like smoke from a train she hadn't boarded yet. Then a voice cut through the noise. Not them, it was Ivan Petrovich, the guard with the bandaged wrist, the one who tapped his boot to the radio tune. Every head turned. The officer beside him blinked, confused. Ivan repeated, louder this time, not them. They rebuild faster, and they sing. For a heartbeat, the camp froze. A Soviet lieutenant stepped forward, face stone, cold. You question orders? He asked. Ivan didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked once before he said, no, I'm following sense. The silence that followed was heavier than any punishment. Behind them, the women didn't dare move. Anna's pulse hammered in her ears. For a Soviet soldier to interfere with a transfer was nearly unthinkable. Records show less than 2% of guards ever requested to keep specific POW groups under their watch. Yet Ivan stood his ground. Finally, the lieutenant exhaled and motioned the clerk over. Papers shuffled, stamps hit wood. The transfer list changed. They stay. The lieutenant muttered, turning away. The relief was silent, but tangible like oxygen returning to a sealed room. Anna watched Ivan as he walked past her, not looking up, his breath forming clouds in the cold. He didn't smile, didn't expect thanks, but the small defiance had rewritten their fates. That night, the women worked later than usual, perhaps to prove he'd been right. They cleared debris, patched roofs, even hummed softly under their breath as they worked. Ivan passed by once, adjusting his coat against the cold, and for the first time since capture, Anna caught herself smiling. Kindness had turned dangerous. It could cost him everything, but it also meant something had shifted irreversibly. A week later, the sound of unfamiliar engines rolled in through the valley, vehicles painted with a Red Cross emblem. The women froze again, this time in disbelief. Engines idled at the camp gate, kicking up snow and diesel fumes. The red crosses on the vehicles gleamed faintly under the morning sun, symbols not seen here in months. The guards straightened, uncertain whether to salute or stand aside. The International Committee of the Red Cross had arrived, and with them came notebooks, cameras, and eyes that noticed everything. The POW were ordered to line up, washed, combed, patched into presentable shapes. The smell of soap hung awkwardly in the air. Anna clutched her coat tighter, her heart pounding against the hidden journal in her boot. She didn't know if writing the truth would damn her or save her. The inspectors moved down the line, clicking photographs, asking measured questions through interpreters. Food rations, medical care, discipline, the women answered carefully, aware that one wrong word could cost them or their guards. The Soviet officers watched from a distance, faces blank. A Swiss delegate noted in his report, "Conditions humane, morale unexpectedly stable." It was true against all logic. This camp didn't reek of despair. The women were thin, yes, but alive, alert, even calmer. When one inspector asked Anna what she did here, she hesitated, then said quietly, "We rebuild." The man looked at her torn sleeve and nodded once. He wrote something in his ledger and moved on. Photographs from that day survive, grainy, wash, stout images of women standing straight under a pale sky. They don't smile, but neither do they look broken. Behind them, Soviet guards stand loosely, not the rigid figures Western propaganda expected. "We wanted to hate them," Anna wrote later, "but we couldn't. They had stopped hating us first." When the inspection ended, the Red Cross handed out small parcels, soap, chocolate, letters. Anna tore hers open. Inside was a short note from a cousin she hadn't seen since '44. "If you live, write." She smiled faintly, the paper trembling in her hands. As the vehicles departed, one inspector turned back, snapping a final photo of the gate closing. Beyond it, life resumed. The shovels, the smoke, the same strange quiet. But the difference now was proof. The world had seen them. That night, Anna carefully unwrapped her journal. Tomorrow, she'd hide it again, but not here. She was going home. The train screeched into Hamburg beneath a grey, sooty sky. It was 1947. The war had ended 2 years ago, but for the women stepping down from the freight cars, it still lived inside every heartbeat. Their coats hung loose, their hands roughened by frost and brick dust. No uniforms now, just faces that had seen too much and survived anyway. Anna stepped onto the platform last, clutching the small canvas bag she'd been given at the border. Inside were 2 things, a Red Cross ration tin and her journal, bound now in twine. The wind off the Elbe cut through her thin coat, but she didn't shiver. She was back in Germany, back among ruins that looked eerily like Glogau's. A crowd of ex-auxiliaries had gathered in a church basement nearby, former radio clerks, nurses, typists. Someone had spread word that a few returnees were willing to speak. Anna stood by the doorway at first, listening. The room buzzed with bitterness and disbelief. They starved us, they used us, they stripped us. Then Anna opened her bag. She set her journal on the table, its edges smudged and torn. "They took our uniforms," she said quietly, "and gave us back something else ourselves." The room went silent. She read a few lines aloud about the stew, the bandages, the cigarette shared in ruins. No sentimentality, just truth. The women listened, their expressions softening from anger to something harder to name. One whispered, "Then maybe not everything we lost was wasted." By 1949, over 1 million German POW were repatriated from the Soviet Union. Most returned skeletal, speechless, or unwilling to speak at all. Anna was different. She carried her proof. Pages of confusion, fear, and quiet redemption. That night, she walked along the river, past warehouses still scarred by bombs. The city lights shimmered on the water, reflecting fragments of a world rebuilt from ash. Freedom, she realized, didn't feel light. It felt heavy, like carrying all the ghosts home with you. She stopped on the bridge, opened her journal one last time, and read the final entry aloud to no one. They took our uniforms, and we learned to be human without them. Then she closed it, tucked it under her arm, and walked on into the fog.